December 1926. In England, near a chalk quarry at Newlands Corner, a Morris coupe is found abandoned. Inside the car, a passport and a fur coat. And on the driver's license, one name that instantly turns this into national news. Agatha Christie, already one of the era's most famous mystery writers. She leaves the car behind, and she vanishes, cleanly, almost like a scene from one of her own novels. Authorities search the quarry and the surrounding water. Newspapers across the country flood the public with headlines. And then things get even stranger. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, takes a piece of Christie's clothing to a psychic medium, hoping for a clue. It's like a surreal, all-star crossover of the mystery world, spilling out into real life. 11 days later, she's found in Yorkshire at the Swan Hydro Hotel. The guest book lists her as Mrs. Teresa Neele, a name she chose by borrowing the last name of her husband's mistress. Hotel staff later say she read the newspapers every morning, including stories about her own disappearance, and yet she seemed to have no idea it was about her. And Christie never publicly explained those 11 days. Not really. She left them as a blank space, one of the most famous blanks in modern literary history. It's only one of the many silences she left behind. Her life carried mysteries, and her novels often feel like reflections of those mysteries, carefully lit, carefully staged, and still not fully solved. Agatha Christie was born in 1890 in Torquay, Devon, in a comfortable upper-middle-class household. She grew up in a way that was unusual even for her time. Her mother, Clara Miller, believed in a bold educational idea. Don't rush a child into reading. Teach them to imagine first. So Clara planned to delay Agatha's reading lessons until she was around 8. But that plan didn't last. By about age 5, Agatha basically taught herself to read anyway. Still, what mattered most wasn't the reading. It was what she did before reading became her official skill. She learned to invent stories on demand. She would sit with a newspaper held upside down, looking completely serious as if she were reading. If her family asked what it said, she would instantly narrate a plot, made up on the spot. Everyone laughed. But that was, in a very real sense, her first creative act. Improvising narrative, confidently, in front of an audience. The family garden became her first stage. She had an imaginary friend, Boy, who was her first listener and critic. Trees felt like characters to her, each with a distinct personality. She even said her favorite oak tree was the one that was easiest to talk to. Later, in her memoir, she described that feeling clearly. She wasn't alone. Everything around her felt like story. She also had musical talent. She wanted to become a pianist, but intense stage fright made that impossible. It sounds like failure, until you realize what it gave her. She learned something about rhythm and structure that she later brought into writing. She compared detective fiction to a symphony. Every note has to land in the right place, and the final solution has to feel like a finale, everything snapping into a single, satisfying shape. By the time she seriously started reading books around age 10, she already had a huge reservoir of imagination. She read Edgar Allan Poe and fell in love with the pull of mystery. She wrote her first short story, The House in the Blizzard. The killer was the gardener. Even as a kid, she was already drawn to reversal and revelation, the little turn of the screw at the end. That strange gap in her early education, this intentional delay, this emphasis on imagination, became an asset. Instead of being trained into a strict literary mold, she grew into storytelling in her own way. And later, when she started bending the rules of the genre, maybe she could do it so naturally because she hadn't internalized those rules as sacred in the first place. When World War I broke out, Agatha became a VAD nurse, part of Britain's voluntary aid detachments. It ended up being a fateful choice. She was assigned to a hospital dispensary where she handled medicines and chemicals every day. Without trying to, she found a lifelong source of material. She learned the chemistry of death. Working in the dispensary meant living around poisons and drugs. Later, she wrote something chillingly practical. Being surrounded by poison, choosing poisoning as a method of murder in fiction began to feel almost natural. She even once misread a prescription and nearly put a patient in danger. The incident shook her. It stayed with her. And it fed her writing, especially the kind of scenes where one tiny mistake becomes a life-or-death pivot. The hospital also gave her another encounter that mattered. Belgian refugees. Their posture, their accents, their sense of pride. One particular refugee officer's perfectionism left a strong impression. Out of those impressions, her most iconic detective took shape. Hercule Poirot. Small, egg-shaped head, immaculate moustache, and a fierce faith in order and logic. Poirot became the lead in her first published mystery, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Christie later described how casually it began. "I was bored, so I started writing about someone being murdered." She says it almost like it's nothing. But that boredom turned into one of the most significant careers in mystery history. The book was published in 1920. It had been rejected multiple times, 6 rejections, before a publisher finally accepted it. And then it took off. The machine had started. On December 3rd, 1926, Agatha left her husband Archie a short note. "I'm going to Yorkshire for the weekend." That night, she drove her Morris coupe and disappeared. 11 days later, she was found at a hotel, registered under the name Teresa Neele, built from the last name of her husband's mistress, Nancy Neele. Right before she vanished, Archie had asked her for a divorce. He had fallen in love with Nancy. And this was happening not long after Agatha's mother had died. Grief stacked on betrayal, stacked on pressure, everything at once. Hotel staff later described her behavior as eerie. Every morning she read the newspapers, papers filled with massive headlines about her own disappearance, but she showed no reaction. At night, she went to the dance hall. She danced. She chatted with other guests. She seemed normal. Too normal. So what was it? Complete amnesia? Or a complete performance? Psychiatrists diagnosed her with dissociative amnesia, a temporary loss of memory triggered by extreme stress. But suspicion never faded. Some people believed it was revenge on an unfaithful husband. Others suggested it was a publicity stunt so perfect it felt like one of her plots. Christie never explained it. Not openly. Even her autobiography leaves this period as a blank. The 1926 disappearance became her most perfect mystery, the one story she refused to write an ending for. And yet, it also became a turning point. The crisis pushed her into a new beginning. To heal, she traveled to the Middle East, taking long trains, including the kind of journey that would later feed the atmosphere of Murder on the Orient Express. Then, in Baghdad, she met someone who changed her life, a young archaeologist named Max Mallowan. Their first meeting is almost comically symbolic. She accidentally broke one of his precious artifacts. But instead of driving them apart, that mistake brought them closer. He made a remark that hit her exactly where she lived. Fitting broken pieces together is a lot like writing a detective story. After that, she began joining excavation sites. She would clean artifacts carefully with small brushes, sometimes even a simple nail brush, bringing buried history back into view, one grain at a time. It was a perfect match for her mind. Ancient mysteries meeting modern mysteries. Books like Murder in Mesopotamia and Death in the Desert come straight out of this period. After the disappearance, her work deepened. The psychology sharpened. The twists became more shocking, but still persuasive, still engineered. It's tempting to think that the 11-day blank, however painful, was part of the process that forged the true Agatha Christie. Here's something people often get wrong about her. Agatha Christie's workspace wasn't some dramatic writer's office with a desk and a typewriter. Sometimes it wasn't even a desk at all. It was a bathtub. She would soak in hot water, eat apples, and build plots in her head. She once said, half joking, half not, that planning a murder while eating an apple is actually a pretty pleasant feeling. Her method was distinctive and highly technical. First, she decided the ending. Who did it and why? Then she worked backward, placing clues in reverse like assembling a puzzle from the final image to the first piece. Her rule was simple. Trick the reader, yes, but be fair. Every clue has to be inside the story. Her publishing contract demanded a steady output, basically a book a year. That pressure is enough to crush most writers. Christie's solution was practical and almost industrial. She worked on 2 stories at the same time. If she got stuck on one, she switched to the other. She wrote early drafts in shorthand, and later a secretary typed them up. And then there are her 2 legendary detectives, 2 different engines for solving human darkness. Poirot solves through logic. He trusts his little grey cells, the machinery of reasoning. Miss Marple works differently. She understands people. She recognizes patterns of cruelty, vanity, and fear the way a small village recognizes gossip. In her world, human nature is the real evidence. Christie didn't just write popular mysteries, she changed the form. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was revolutionary. The narrator is the killer. When it came out, critics called it cheating, a violation. And yet today it's regularly ranked as one of the greatest twists in the history of the genre. And Then There Were None was another kind of breakthrough. It's less about who is the killer and more about how does the killer defeat both the characters and the reader while still obeying the rules. 10 people are trapped in isolation. One by one, they disappear. And the reader keeps believing, right up until the end, that the story is playing fair. The final shock isn't just the identity of the killer, it's how coldly, how precisely the structure was engineered to hide that identity. Seeing Christie as only a mystery writer is a mistake. She contained more contradictions than her own plots. For one thing, she surfed. In the 1920s, she learned to ride waves at Waikiki in Hawaii, often described as one of the first British women to surf there. She once said that on the waves, every worry disappears. It's a striking image. The world's most famous architect of murder and deception, doing something pure and physical and joyful. She also had a strong eye as a photographer. While traveling with Mallowan, she documented excavation sites, taking photos and keeping records. Places like Nimrud became part of her lived experience, not just exotic backdrops, but real, dusty, practical days of work and observation. And she didn't only write mysteries. Under the pen name Mary Westmacott, she wrote 6 romance novels. She later said those were harder than detective fiction, because love is harder to describe accurately than mystery. In 1952, her play The Mousetrap premiered in London's West End. She gave the performance rights income to her grandson. She reportedly believed it might run for about 8 months. Instead, it ran for decades, over 70 years, and in 2025, it reached the milestone of 30,000 performances. She became one of the best-selling authors in history, translated more widely than almost anyone, often placed just behind Shakespeare. But she didn't seem obsessed with the labels. She said she simply wanted to tell stories. In 1976, she died, leaving one last, very Christie-like detail. She had written the final Poirot story, Curtain, and the final Miss Marple story, Sleeping Murder, decades earlier, and kept them sealed away in a safe, like she was saving endings for the future. She once said that every good mystery needs a missing piece, the blank space the reader fills in themselves. That's exactly what she became. Agatha Christie is still not complete. New interpretations keep coming. New adaptations keep reshaping her work. BBC series, Kenneth Branagh films, manga adaptations in Japan, and more. Her stories keep returning in new forms. The Queen of Mystery is gone, but the puzzles are still alive. So, what's your favorite Christie book? If you've never read her, my easiest entry point is And Then There Were None. It moves fast, and it gives you that immediate, oh, this is what Christie is, feeling. If you want something more classic and traditional with Poirot, Murder on the Orient Express is also a strong start. Thanks for watching.